Hello, everyone. I hope you had a wonderful weekend. It's great to be back with you, and I'm ready to talk a bit about the political science of the Constitution today. In our last lecture, we considered the philosophy of the Articles of Confederation and the anti federalist author Brutus, who, in many respects, is defending elements of the Confederation. I want to begin simply by reminding us what the Articles of Confederation did. They did not really establish a strong national government. Of that, you can be sure. In fact, what it created was a league of friendship between the states that allowed the states to work together for shared purposes such as national security and war making, but otherwise left them free and independent. If you read through the Articles of Confederation, you notice that Articles 2 and 3 are very clear in their guarantee of state sovereignty. They provide an unambiguous statement that all powers not given to the Congress by this confederation are reserved to the states, which are said to be guaranteed in their freedom, sovereignty, and independence. So the states were the sovereign entities of the Articles of Confederation. They were the ones, rather than the national government, that were the ultimate source of political authority. Ever since the Articles of Confederation, the ideas of state sovereignty and states' rights have continued to deeply influence the American political tradition. Some of you who are familiar with American history may remember the battle between Thomas Jefferson and the Federalists, in which Jefferson, in the Kentucky resolutions, appeals to the principle of states' rights to criticize the Federalist Party for creating a national bank and doing other things that he perceives to be unconstitutional. More famously still, the South, in the lead up to the Civil War, asserted the theory of state sovereignty in order to justify its secession from the Union during preempting the Civil War. And in modern times, with an issue that is undoubtedly close to many of your hearts, the Supreme Court sent abortion policy back to the states, ruling on the grounds that health policy was a reserved right to the states and under our constitutional system. We can see by all this that even though the Constitution replaced the Articles of Confederation, the states' rights principles of the Articles never totally died. Some, such as the famous Southern statesman John C. Calhoun, believed that the Constitution simply represented an evolution of the Articles rather than a total abandonment of it. Others, such as Abraham Lincoln, said instead that the Constitution consolidated the Union, a union that was originally created by the Declaration of Independence. One thing is for certain. Even though the framers convened in Philadelphia, as you can see in this picture here, which I have on the wall of my office at Colorado Christian University, the framers at the Philadelphia Convention pictured here, they ostensibly met with the purpose of simply proposing reforms to the Articles of Confederation. And yet the Constitution they proposed ended up looking radically different from it. Remember that under the Articles, you have a system of legislative supremacy. You don't have a two-house Congress. You don't have a president. You don't have a Supreme Court. And yet the Constitution gives us all of those things. Some critics of the Constitution, some of the anti-federalists said, well, hang on now, this is pretty illegal. You guys were sent there to reform the Articles, not abandon them. And while there is certainly truth to this claim, we ought to keep in mind the concern of the framers. They believed that if all we did was simply reform the Articles to give the Congress more power, then our liberties would not really be protected, because there's no checks and balances within the constitutional system of the Articles that would prevent Congress from endangering the rights of the people. The primary reason Congress was not tyrannical in the years of the Articles was simply because it couldn't do anything. The laws that it passed were more like suggestions, and the money it raised was only done basically by volunteer work from the states, right? And so this Articles of Confederation established such a weak government that it couldn't really do anything. If we meet and change that and give the Congress new tools to regulate the affairs of the states, all of a sudden we run into a danger of possible tyranny. So a new system is needed. That was their belief. Today we're going to take a look at this new system as it is relayed in the Federalist Papers. We're going to try to understand how the framers understood the work of the Constitutional Convention and the purpose of the Constitution that they helped create. I have here a famous quote from the Federalist number 51, perhaps one of the most famous of all quotes from the Federalist Papers. James Madison queries, he says, "What is government itself but the greatest of all reflections on human nature? If men were angels, no government would be necessary." Naturally, Madison goes on in that Federalist essay to say that men are not angels. This may be surprising to some Americans today who seem to think the American people can do no wrong. But that was not the view of the framers. The framers, as we're going to see, they thought that human nature is capable of great things, but they also believed that there are certain dangers that you run into. At the end of the day, all government has to take its bearings from the limitations of human nature, not simply the virtuous qualities of it. And that's going to be, I will argue, one of the central insights of the constitutional framers. It was their sober understanding of human nature and their willingness to design a government that took its bearings not only from the high qualities, which they appreciated, but also from the lower qualities. So we're going to understand this, and I hope we come away from this lecture with an appreciation for the genius of the framers and for how their insights resonate with us even today. So often we hear that the framers and the Constitution, they are outdated because what does George Washington know about airplanes and telephones and these other things that we take for granted today? But they were designing a government that was rooted in eternal principles of human nature. They believed that laws can and should change with the march of time, but a constitution is fundamentally different from a law, or at least an ordinary law. A constitution is the charter of government that is going to be the foundation for all other legislation that will flow from throughout time. And so the Constitution was meant to be based on these permanent principles that wouldn't change. And we're going to see that there still is great wisdom in the insights of the framers. So before we move into a study of the documents themselves, I would like to initially just open by considering what the Federalist Papers are. The Federalist Papers are basically, so they were originally written as newspaper editorials in New York newspapers. They were intended to help ratify the new Constitution, which was being debated. Remember that when the Constitution was proposed, in order for it to go into effect, it required the ratification of 9 out of 13 popular state ratifying conventions. Well, New York was one of the most critical of all the states. It was among the biggest states. It was considered a swing state in those days and age, in that day and age, believe it or not. And there was a common view that as New York goes, so will go the nation, because it was it was pretty close to either being the 9th state or being the 8th state, something like that. It was one of the ones that would be very close in the process of ratifying the Constitution. If, remember, 9 states are what you need. And so if the Constitution went down to defeat there, it would certainly go down to defeat in the subsequent states. And so that's why New York was so important. Well, the Federalist Papers, they were not published under the names Alexander Hamilton, James Madison, and John Jay, even though those were the primary authors of the Federalist Papers. Two of those men were at the Constitutional Convention, Hamilton and Madison. John Jay was himself a governor of New York. All of these men were distinguished. And the reason that they did not write under their own name is because they wanted to make sure that those who were reading the papers were actually trying to understand the arguments and focusing on those, not so much focusing on the personality making the arguments. It is common for us today to see that some person we don't like, so maybe some senator writes an op-ed for the New York Times or the Wall Street Journal or something. So, for example, Senator Liz Warren, she writes a op-ed on the climate change crisis, and someone like me might look at that and be like, well, I'm not going to listen to her. She's just going to blow hot air. I don't like anything else she says, so why should I read this or even think about it, right? Even though I would hold that is true for Liz Warren, nonetheless, the framers are aware of this kind of thing. And that's one reason that they wanted to write anonymously. They didn't want their readers to think to themselves, well, hey, Alexander Hamilton, that guy is pretty crazy. He's a hardcore nationalist. He doesn't believe in the states at all. He might want to sort of consolidate all the states, just as the anti-federalist Warren. Or James Madison, this kind of radical fellow from Virginia who fought long and hard for the disestablishment of the Anglican Church from Virginia. Why should I listen to him if I'm an Anglican, right? Well, that kind of tendency was what they were trying to avoid. They didn't want you to think, well, I like Governor Jay, so I'm going to simply affirm whatever position he's arguing for. Or I hate Hamilton and Madison, so I'm going to disclaim whatever position they're arguing for. No, they write under the name Publius because they want us to care about the arguments being made, not the people making them. But there's also something else going on there that's of interest to us. The name Publius, what is this? Well, some of you who are Latinists may know that this is a Roman name. This is a name of a famous character from the history of the Roman Republic. Publius was a famous consul of Rome. He helped to preserve the Republic by improving it. Madison and Hamilton and Jay certainly think they can do the same thing in America. And so that's why they chose this name. It's a striking contrast from the name chosen by the anti-federalist author Brutus. If you know Julius Caesar and that story, you'll know that Brutus is the one who assassinates Caesar, right? And so when the anti-federalist author writes under the name Brutus, you have the suggestion being made somewhat subtly, but nonetheless profoundly, that this Constitution is a Caesar, or at least it's going to create a kind of Caesarism, a kind of tyranny. And I'm going to assassinate it, not so much with a knife, as the ancient Brutus did, but instead with arguments. And so Roman names were popular. But in contrast to the anti-federalist Brutus, who is suggesting the Constitution is going to destroy liberty, the Federalist authors who write under the name Publius suggest that really this is going to save the Republic in a dark moment. And so that's an important thing to keep in mind. Another thing I want to open our study of the Federalist Papers essays with is the way that it teaches us something about prudence in statesmanship. Madison and Hamilton were both key players at the Constitutional Convention. But that much is well known. But what is often not well known is the fact that these two fellows were pretty radical in their aspiration to undermine the power of the states. In many ways, those two men, they were on the same page in arguing for a kind of consolidation, where the states would be pretty much stripped of all of their sovereignty and a new national government would be established that wouldn't depend on them in any way. When he was at the Constitutional Convention, Madison had supported the famous Virginia Plan, It was a plan that gave more power to the larger states. And it was a plan that actually stripped the state governments out of the system in the sense of they wouldn't be responsible for the selection of any of the major federal officers. And so this was very far from being a states' rights plan. Madison had also opposed the New Jersey Plan, which was a plan to reform the Articles of Confederation. Well, these two plans, the Virginia and New Jersey Plan, the Virginia Plan favored the large states, or the large states favored it. The New Jersey Plan was favored by the small states, because the Virginia Plan would have decided the representation in Congress based on how big a state is. And if you're a big state, that means you get more in the Congress, and so you can call the shots. The New Jersey Plan, however, was a reform of the Articles, and so it preserved the equality between the states, giving more power to the small states over legislation. Well, the final constitution that emerges in a process of consensus building and compromise. It emerges through what was known as the Great Compromise, facilitated by the state of Connecticut and its delegates Roger Sherman and Oliver Ellsworth. Well, this compromise was intended to basically placate both the large and the small states, give something to both of them. And so, following the Virginia Plan, the plan of the new Constitution following this Constitution would give the lower house of Congress to the big states. So the House of Representatives is based on population. That means that to this day, New York and California get more than the tiny states do. However, the New Jersey Plan has some echoes in the Constitution too, because the Senate ended up preserving the equality of representation for each state, and it gave the state governments a right to choose their senators. Both of these elements of the Senate end up protecting the federal structure of the constitutional system, guaranteeing states' rights and giving us something of the spirit of the Articles of Confederation. Well, I say all that not only because it's an important point for you to know for the quiz, but also because it's important to keep in mind that people like Madison and Hamilton, they were much more favorable to the large state plan. They were more favorable to, in Madison's case, the Virginia Plan, or in Hamilton's case, to an even more radical plan than the Virginia Plan. They were more sympathetic to nationalist plans. They didn't really like the compromises that made the small states more powerful and guaranteed more rights to the states. But even though they thought there may have been too many concessions made to the power of the states, these guys still took to the papers in order to defend the handiwork of the framers. This teaches us important lessons about prudence and about statesmanship. Sometimes perfect adherence to firm principles is impossible, and we ought to aim for the next best thing. These guys are so successful at writing in a unified voice, so that's another important point to keep in mind. Hamilton and Madison and Jay, they're not really writing as another purpose of the Publius name is not only to hide their identity and have a Roman illusion, but it's also to give them a unified voice. They want to write from the perspective of the consensus view of the framers. So they're trying to write as much as they can in a way that isn't just Hamilton's opinion or Madison's opinion or Jay's opinion, but an opinion that's respectful of the intentions of most people at the Constitutional Convention. And there's probably some places where they still allow their own biases and prejudices to get in. But nonetheless, I think they're remarkably successful. They're so successful at writing in this unified voice that in fact many scholars have debated which Federalist paper belongs to whom. I think at this point we have a pretty good idea of who wrote each one, but there's still a few that are ambiguous even to this day, because Hamilton and Madison, who are the principal authors, they did such a good job of writing in a way that came off as if they were the same person. John Jay, he intended to write more, but he actually was attacked. He was hit in the head with a brick, if I recall correctly, and he ends up recovering from an illness or recovering from a subsequent illness after that, and he's unable to write more than 5 essays in a 80-something essay series. So that's why poor Jay didn't write as many. But nonetheless, his contributions are quite memorable as they stand. So in this lecture, we're going to take a close look at 3 major Federalist papers: Federalist 1, Federalist 10, and Federalist 51. These are 3 of the most classic essays in the entire Federalist canon. They are ones that, of all the Federalist papers, you really should read those. Federalist 1, written by Alexander Hamilton, is a masterful introduction. In many ways, it does every single thing an introduction in an essay should do. So keep this in mind, those of you who are writers or who are going to be writing academic essays. We have one due this weekend, actually, so keep this in mind. But he writes a masterful introduction. It orients us to the topic that is being debated. It signals to readers why they should care about the topic, and it makes clear what Publius's stance is going to be and provides a kind of general overview of what the organization of the Federalist Papers is going to be. So, as an introduction, it is stellar. Federalist number 10, written by James Madison, is one of the most theoretical of all of the Federalist essays. It argues against the anti-Federalist belief, which we explored last week, in a small republic. It maintains instead that a large, extended republic will better protect us against the problem of faction and guarantee the blessings of republican government. Federalist 51, much later in the Federalist series, explains the Constitution's institutional system of separated powers and checks and balances. It also gives us something of a picture of the relationship between those two things. Sometimes we confuse the separation of powers with checks and balances when technically they are different things and arguably contradict each other. We're going to explore that whenever we look at Federalist 51 more closely. I want us to come away from this lecture understanding that while the Anti-Federalists made many very good and valid points, the Federalist arguments are worth considering as well. Federalists maintain that ultimately the Anti-Federalists are incorrect in saying that the Constitution will create this dangerous consolidated system that will destroy the rights of the states and give unlimited power to a central government. The Federalists say no. They say that the Constitution was designed in a careful way that would carefully limit government power and protect the rights of individuals and states alike. And so we need to understand both sides of this argument if we're going to make sense of this important moment in the American political tradition. So let's open with Federalist number 1. In Federalist number 1, we see Alexander Hamilton open the essay immediately by telling us about the importance of a strong union to the success of the new nation. Hamilton believes that the Constitution is a great improvement over the Articles of Confederation. But even though it is an improvement, he acknowledges that there are many people, he is here referencing the Anti-Federalists, who oppose it. There's a kind of ambivalence about these Anti-Federalists in the Federalist number 1 essay. He says some of these opponents of the Constitution are simply self-interested politicians who do not want to lose the incredible power that they have in their state governments. These are Anti-Federalist governors such as John Hancock of Massachusetts and George Clinton of New York. These are people who like being the biggest fish in a small pond, more than they would like to be a big fish in a huge pond, right? And so they stand to lose something by ratifying the new Constitution and shifting a lot of power away from the states and to the national government. All of a sudden, I'm not going to be the big guy. It's going to be someone like George Washington in the national government. And so Hamilton is pretty skeptical of these people. He thinks that these kinds of people are basically demagogues. They use scare tactics to stir the passions of the people and get them to resist the new Constitution, even if it means telling lies about it and sounding hysterical. However, Hamilton doesn't simply end the story there. He says that other anti-federalists, and he suggests that perhaps more anti-federalists than not, are sincere in their motives, and they simply believe the Constitution is a threat to liberty. Hamilton says, these are the people that I want to reach with this essay. These are the people that I want to persuade. And so it's important to keep in mind that he wants to persuade his opponents that they are mistaken. He doesn't want to destroy them or character assassinate them. This is a lesson that I would hold many Americans today should learn. Sometimes when you're just shouting at one another and calling each other names, you're only really entrenching your opponents in their rigid beliefs. You're not really making them willing to listen to your own points and arguments. Hamilton says we have to insist upon the need for reasoned argument and debate. This is one of the most important reasons that republicanism is the best mode of government. And so Hamilton, who is not well known for a particularly high view of human nature, he nonetheless sounds very positive about human nature in Federalist Number 1. Human nature is depicted as something with the capacity for rationality and for deliberation. And there's an emphasis on American exceptionalism that's connected with this. We have an opportunity as the American people that is unlike that of any other nation in the history of the human race. An opportunity to prove that Republican self-government is both workable and desirable. And so America, of all nations, has this Republican opportunity. We can show the world that republicanism is not a vain dream, but is something that draws out the best in human nature. And we can start by ratifying the Constitution. So he opens with this very famous and remarkable passage, I think, that I often quote to students. Note at the opening of Federalist 1 how he puts it. It has been frequently remarked that it seems to have been reserved to the people of this country, by their conduct and example, to decide the all and important question of whether societies of men are really capable or not of establishing good government from reflection and choice, or whether they are forever destined to depend for their political constitutions on accident and force. So America and our Republican experiment, unlike all other nations in history, we have the opportunity to design a system based on wise reflection and deliberative choice. Most other governments have been based on either accident or force. This includes free governments as well. So, for example, a dictatorship like China or Russia, these kinds of countries are based on force, right? They're not based on high qualities in human nature. They're held together by the force of the sword. Well, Britain, which is a free society and was also a free society when Hamilton was writing this, Britain would nonetheless be described as a society whose freedoms were somewhat based on accident. The liberties that are enjoyed by the British Bill of Rights, by the English constitutional system, these are liberties that developed over a long period of time in a series of historical accidents, like the way the Lords forced concessions out of King John, resulting in the Magna Carta, right? The liberties that they have were not based on a process of popular consent or the establishment and founding of a free Republican Constitution. That's what makes America different. We have the opportunity to bring into being a free government simply by our own individual consent. And so reflection and choice is the basis of American republicanism. And it's also the basis of the Constitution. So reflection and choice is not only something that the people at the moment of the founding have to engage in to choose whether or not to ratify the Constitution. you're going to see the argument made throughout the Federalist Papers that the whole purpose of the constitutional system that we enjoy today is to promote this kind of reasoned reflection and deliberative choice. Checks and balances and the separation of powers in large part have this purpose of forcing deliberation and forcing government to be based on a much more rational kind of quality in human nature. And so this leads us to Federalist number 10. Because if human nature has this capacity for reasoned reflection and choice, it also harbors darker propensities such as factiousness and self-interest. These are propensities that any wise Republican constitution would have to check if it's going to be successful. This is one of the main themes of Federalist number 10. So I have here a picture of Yoda's quote, "Size matters not," and James Madison in a caricature form under him. Well, I have these two together because Madison rejects Yoda. He doesn't like Yoda's position. He says size does matter. He says actually a larger republic is going to be the best, and here's why. But there's also another similarity between Madison and Yoda. Madison was only a little taller than Yoda. He is historically, I think, the shortest American president at about 5 feet 4 inches. And so he was kind of a tiny man, right? But if he was a tiny man in terms of his height, he was a towering stature in his intellect. And Federalist 10 helps us to understand this. It is rightly considered one of the most famous of all the Federalist essays. One reason for the fame that it enjoys is because it makes a strikingly original argument on behalf of the new Constitution. As we discussed in our lecture on the Anti-Federalists, most political philosophers, from Aristotle to Montesquieu on, had argued that a republic had to be small if it wanted to preserve its liberties. Smallness of size preserves a quality of trust and a common way of life in the people. This is the tradition of thought that the Anti-Federalists are drawing upon. They worried that as the size of a community expands, you take in a more diverse and heterogeneous array of citizens. Think of a giant metropolis like New York City. Very diverse, and I don't even just mean racially. I mean it's diverse in really all possible ways in terms of how people make their living, what their economic status looks like, the languages they speak. They become these massive, almost city-states, right? And so in a local community in Middle America, the Anti-Federalists would perhaps say, you might see a bunch of citizens who all work similar jobs and who have a similar economic status. This is in small-town America. It's easier for these citizens to work together and to trust one another because they come from a similar walk of life. They're more likely to understand each other's problems. And so the smallness of size helps to preserve this kind of sense of trust and affection and friendship, as we discussed in our lecture on the Anti-Feds. But in a national community, as a community gets much bigger and starts to look more like New York or like modern America, a continental nation, the republic begins to include all kinds of diverse interests. It includes agricultural communities, farming communities, manufacturers, the wealthy classes, the poor classes, and so on and so forth. This could create conflict, since not all the interests that compose the republic are the same. And sometimes they even have interests that are averse to one another. Think of how there's often in history a kind of class conflict between the wealthy and the poor. Well, the Anti-Federalists look at this kind of thing and they say, well, this means that if you want to have a good republic, the last thing you need is for it to get big. Because this diversity of interest and this hugeness of size, well, what it does is it breeds faction. It creates elements in the republic that see themselves as united themselves against the rights of the whole. And so, for example, in this large republic, if you're a wealthy person, you might see yourself as dedicated to helping the needs of your class rather than the needs of the nation. And so Anti-Fed said, we gotta keep things small as we can. And so Madison, the reason Federalist 10 is very famous is because he takes this anti-Fed argument and he basically turns it on its head. So he admits that a large extended republic is certainly going to be more heterogeneous and diverse in its interests. It is also going to make faction more likely. And you might be thinking, well, hang on now, doesn't that mean that he's just admitting that the Constitution is a bad idea? Well, no, because Madison says that paradoxically, rather than being a bad thing, this multiplication of faction is actually a good thing. Why? Because it can actually mitigate against the problem of faction, even while it accepts their inevitability. In a roundabout way, you end up seeing a politics where he thinks that justice and the general good will be served by the proliferation of faction. So let's dive into this a little more specifically to understand what he's saying. Madison defines a faction as a number of citizens who are united in some common impulse that is averse to the rights of a minority of the community. So these are citizens who are in the business of politics not because they care about the good of the community, but because they want to help themselves, right? So if you have a faction, you have a group of self-interested people that just want to do something that's good for themselves at the expense of the whole. We hear this kind of thing all the time, but it is often connected to more modern sounding language of special interests, right? That's a similar term or a more modern term for what Madison is getting at here. Madison agrees with the Anti-Federalists that faction is a bad thing. And he is especially worried about the possibility of majority faction. This is similar to what we would refer to as the tyranny of the majority. Even though we're a very democratic nation and we often praise democratic values, we sometimes do not discern with the insight that Madison did that majorities can sometimes be a great threat to the rights of minorities. So you can talk all you want about just have more democracy, but if people are voting to exploit or oppress or enslave the 49% just because they have the 51%, well, that's not really good government, even if it's favored by the majority. And so for republicanism to be valuable, it has to be more than just this kind of pure democracy or pure majority rule. Think about things like segregation. This was something that was certainly favored by the majority if you're looking simply at the numbers of voters in the South, but it did not have the rights of minority groups in mind. And so Madison is especially worried about these majority factions. He thinks that a minority faction is not as much of a problem. And he has a point here. So here's what he says. He says, when minority factions are created, they can already simply be checked simply by having elections. They don't have the numbers to actually win, so we shouldn't really be that worried about them. So you can think today about some of the crazier fringe third parties, right? So America technically has a communist party and an American Nazi party. But these parties have absolutely no chance of winning. They are so fringe that their numbers are minuscule. And so we don't really need to worry about them seizing power very much. So a minority faction is checked simply by its status of being in the minority. The problem is much more serious when you have a majority faction, because elections can't save you by themselves from those kinds of factions. We have to check the influence of a majority faction in other ways. So how can we do this? Well, Madison suggests that two proposals have failed so far to eliminating the problem of majority faction. So these two problems have failed because they aim to simply abolish faction. So Madison says one solution to the problem of faction has been to simply abolish the liberty that gives rise to faction. Right? So in a free society, people disagree with each other about things. Well, this helps create factions. That's one thing that you could do. Just get rid of liberty. Then you might not have to worry about faction. But Madison says that's absurd, because then you won't have a republic. Similarly, the other solution that has been proposed is to give to everyone the same opinions, passions, and interests. So if you just make everyone think the same way, then you can get rid of faction. Well, this is also impossible because, again, in a republic, you're going to have people who think differently about things. And so there's a need to basically resist this idea that we can sort of transform human nature or perfect it simply through governmental institutions. And so what Madison says is that rather than try to uproot faction completely, we have to mitigate against its worst effects. So we need to accept that faction is a kind of reality that we have to deal with, but we have to make sure that it doesn't undermine the government or endanger the liberties of the people. The way to do this is actually the large extended republic that is disavowed by the Anti-Federalists. So here's Madison's argument. He says that when you have a large republic, you're going to have so many different factions in it that it's going to be harder for any one single faction to seize control of the government and oppress minority rights. Each faction becomes smaller, simply by virtue of the fact that the nation is so much larger. And so factions that might have been powerful majorities in some states all of a sudden become very diluted because there's a large extended republic that in some ways mitigates against their influence. Madison says that the small republic vision of the anti-feds is actually utopian because it ignores that even in small communities, there's going to be diversity of interests. So even in a small community, you're not going to have the possibility of making every single person think the same way and have the same way of life. Because in a free society, some people might end up rich, some people might end up poor, right? So the primary difference is just that in a small community, you have fewer factions, not none, but you actually have an easier time of cobbling together a powerful majority faction that can override the rights of minorities. So take an example of this that Madison was concerned about. Madison was a big-time devotee of a kind of strict position on the separation of church and state, religious liberty. Well, in his time, the New England states were very small, so they reflect that anti-federalist kind of vision of a small republic. And they were also very united around their common religious heritage. These were states that were still connected to their Puritan heritage, and almost everyone was some kind of Congregationalist. So in states like Connecticut and New Hampshire and Massachusetts, it was perfectly natural for them to say that we want an established Congregational church and government support for Christianity. We want taxpayer money to support this denomination and not others. Well, Madison is suggesting that this seeming unanimity in the New England states really just resulted in persecution. Persecution of religious dissenters such as deists, Baptists, Anglicans, and others. These minority religions, they couldn't defend themselves against the powerful majority, not because there were not factions or sincere disagreements in those states, but just because in a small sphere, it's a lot easier to get that majority of support for policies that might oppress minority groups. Well, this situation changes pretty dramatically when you have an extended republic, because all of a sudden, Congress is taking in interests from all over the place. It's going to include not only Congregationalists from New England, but Anglicans from Virginia, Presbyterians from the Carolinas, and Baptists from all over the nation. When Congress convenes, it's going to have representatives who are going to consider the interests of all these religious sects and not just one of them. They can't possibly only consider the sect of their neighborhood, right? And so the assortment of factions in a large extended republic actually makes it less likely that one single faction can gain control. To take a sillier example, many of you are homeschoolers, but some of you have undoubtedly seen public schools, right? And some of you may have also gone to private schools. I went to a private school for part of high school. I went to a public school for the other part. And so I can compare the two in this way. In my small Christian private school, you could describe that as being quite homogenous. Most people knew each other. Most people were more similar than different. And there wasn't a lot of anonymity there. Most people knew who each other were and had an interest in other people. And that kind of thing came at a cost. In some ways, it elevated the neighborliness of the school, but it also may have made it easier for people to pry a little too much into your personal life, or for you to never be able to kind of get away, from public scrutiny because the school is so small, this kind of small Christian private school. Great school, and I prefer that, but that's a possible drawback. Well, in a large public school, this is much more Madisonian in the sense of it's going to be large. It's going to have more diverse interests. Not everyone's going to be a Christian. You're going to have Muslims in the class. You're going to have atheists in the class. You're going to have Christians. You're going to have New Agey type religions. You're going to have all these different assortments of people. And you're also going to have all kinds of different cliques and all kinds of different kind of social groups. And so you have the jocks over there, the video game nerds over in the other corner. And in one particularly strange corner, you might have the furries, right? All kinds of these weird different sects in the high school. And the point of this is that because you have this large high school with all of these different interests and factions, so to speak, it becomes harder for any one single one of those groups to totally dominate the school and dominate the others. Madison is saying much the same thing here for the national government. As the nation gets bigger, the factions will in some ways cancel each other out. It'll become a lot harder for a single faction to take control. Legislation that passes has to please a lot of people, and it's going to be more in keeping with the common good. But at the same time, we have to acknowledge serious costs of this. As I mentioned, I quite prefer that kind of private school setting where there is this more elevated sense of trust and affection, that more kind of anti-federalist style system where you have a kind of common way of life and a common mind binding people together. Madison, however, is more concerned that those situations are going to result in oppression. Well, what do we do after the republic is extended? Does that simply solve the problem and give us liberty? Well, Madison actually says no. No, Madison says that an extended republic is not enough, nor is it even enough to have a people of character and virtue. Federalist 51 elaborates. Federalist 51 outlines that a dependence on the people is the most important safeguard for liberty, but we also need a wise constitutional system based on a proper institutional arrangement that will protect liberty. Madison refers to these as auxiliary precautions. They're auxiliary precautions because they're not the most important element of a republic, but they are nonetheless necessary. These are the constitutional institutions, the separation of powers, the checks and balances, these kinds of things that are going to provide guarantees to liberty even in the absence of virtuous statesmen or citizens. The inside of Federalist 51 is that no matter how good your people are, the tendency of all human beings is to abuse power once they obtain it. As we all know, power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. Publius puts it this way. He says, men are not angels, and any successful constitution is not going to expect that humans are angels, or aim to perfect human nature through institutions. we have to accept some of the lower qualities of human nature. So just as the extended republic relies in many ways on a sort of view of human nature as being quite self-interested and based on this kind of passion for activity that can lead to faction, well, the theory behind the separation of powers and checks and balances also depends on this understanding that human beings are going to be self-interested. And so that's the mission of Federalist 51. It's to show that even with an extended republic, you still need this constitutional system of separated powers and checks and balances. Well, one thing that he opens this essay with is an attempt to clear up possible misconceptions about the separation of powers. So when we think about the separation of powers, we're thinking about the organization of the government into three distinctive branches. The legislative branch, which makes law, the executive branch, which enforces law, and the judicial branch, which interprets or adjudicates the law. Well, these three branches all have to be separate, because if you just have one person or one institution doing all these things, well, you're going to have arbitrary government. Think of it. If you had the power to make a law and also to enforce the law and then to interpret the law, well, you might use this power in such a way that you're making rules arbitrarily and justice is not being served. And so that's the separation of powers. But that is not necessarily the same thing as checks and balances. And so this is something that causes some anti-federalists to complain. So think of this, for instance. The president has the ability to veto legislation. This gives the president, who is a member of the executive branch, it gives him a role in the legislative process. Similarly, the Senate has the right to confirm the president's appointments to the cabinets, which are the core departments of the executive branch. These kinds of things seem to violate a certain understanding of the separation of powers, even while they allow for checking and balancing. Because if you think about it, a strictly separate system would not allow the executive or the legislative branches to interact in any way. So why did we allow this? That's what the anti-federalists are asking. That's why they're challenging this system and saying, well, you're giving the president a veto. You're giving the legislature control over the president's administration. Where's the separation of powers in that? Well, Madison says that if you don't give these branches those kinds of tools, then they have no means to defend themselves against the excursions of other branches. These tools are going to serve as methods of self-defense in situations where the legislature, for example, tries to absorb power. So you might have a president whose veto is used to defend essential executive functions against legislative supremacy or attempts at legislative supremacy by the Congress. And so these kinds of things might happen. But it's not just about self-defense. It's also about investing each branch with an interest in its own department. Each branch has to have a kind of sense that it has power to participate in the constitutional system. It has to have a sense of the quality that it has, and a reason to think that as a branch it matters, right? Because you don't want to see branches hand over all their powers to other branches. One problem today is the problem of how the legislative branch has just sent tons and tons of power to the executive and judicial branches. It doesn't seem to have this kind of interest in its own department the way Madison wants them to. And so the different checks and balances of the system invest the officers of the government with an interest in their department. So why did we have checks and balances within the Congress, right? Because Congress is a legislative body, But there's also a checking and balancing going on there between the House and the Senate, which are both parts of the legislature. Well, Madison believes, and there's good reason to believe this, that in a republic, the natural tendency is for the legislative branch to be the most powerful. It's the one that's the most directly connected to the voice of the people. It's the one that is more likely to sympathize with them and to want to work for them. And that's a good thing. So the republic should believe that the legislative branch should predominate. Madison doesn't challenge that. But this also comes with the danger of great abuse. Because the legislature is very deeply connected to the sympathy of the people, it might try to absorb the functions of the other branches. It might try to seize powers away from the executive branch and the judicial branches. And so we have to guard against the possibility of legislative tyranny. So having two houses of Congress was essential for this purpose. You have a House of Representatives, which is more directly connected to the immediate wishes of the people. It has 2-year terms, and it's directly elected. And under the original design, you have a Senate, which is elected by the state governments for 6-year terms. So this gives those institutions a very different constituency of support from one another, and means that all legislation to pass has to have a majority not only of the people dispersed in the House, but also a majority of the states. And so this elaborate system of separated powers and checks and balances takes its bearings from the fact that the branches are going to operate according to their self-interest. The constitutional rights of the place must be invested with the interest of the person, as he puts it. They want to defend the rights of their department when they're threatened by others. But Madison also believes that federalism is going to be a central piece of this constitutional system. He says the state governments and the federal government are both drawn from the authority of the people. They both have their own domains of influence. Most matters, including health, safety, education, and welfare policy, these kinds of policies, they were intended to be left to the states, while the federal government would be in charge of all matters that pertain to the whole nation, such as interstate commerce and national security. Madison expects that the states and the federal government are going to check and balance one another too, preventing either from absorbing too much power. He's unfortunately in this paper not very specific about how this is going to play out in practice. But it is possible that what he means is that the court's power of judicial review may give the federal government a way to check the state governments when they violate the constitutional rights of citizens, while the state government's ability to select senators and choose presidential electors for the Electoral College could give them a check on the federal government. When you think about it, under the original system, the government couldn't even really organize itself without the intervention of the states, because since the senators were chosen by the state governments, if the state said we won't send senators, well, all of a sudden you have no Senate. And similarly, if they say we don't want to send presidential electors to the Electoral College, you can't have a president. And so the state governments are interwoven into the fabric of the constitutional system. Ultimately, Madison hopes that this elaborate system is going to make it not only difficult to pass bad legislation, but make it more likely that when legislation passes, it's going to reflect the principles of justice and the general good. This is interesting, because so often we think of checks and balances as simply a way to shut things down or to kind of slow down government. But Madison thinks that actually this constitutional system is meant to inspire a sense of deliberation. It's meant to force compromise and force consensus building in our constitutional system. It allows all the different minority interests of society to play a part in the legislative process and to hopefully get something without unduly dominating the proceedings of the government. And so this means that ultimately legislation that does pass will be better legislation. It won't simply be based on the immediate whim of a powerful 51% majority, but it's going to be based on a kind of deliberative sense, as he puts it in a later Federalist essay. The deliberative sense of the community ought to prevail. And so laws will be better. It's not only going to shut down bad laws, it's also going to make the laws that do pass be of higher quality. You got to get a majority of the states and a majority of the population on board. And so they really are going to serve the common good in this way. So wrapping things up here, the Federalist gives us a clear picture of how the Constitution was based on a study of human nature. Human nature is capable of reasoned reflection, and it is eminently rational. This means that virtuous self-government by Republican citizens is a possibility that we ought to work to realize. But at the same time, the Federalist Papers is quite clear that men are not angels. Constitutions have to recognize the limits of human nature and the power of self-interestedness. We are not always out to help others, but sometimes we want to help others at the expense, or sometimes we want to help ourselves at the expense of others. So, according to the Federalist, a good constitution is going to promote our most rational and deliberative qualities, while it guards against the possibility of abuse and oppression. This shows that in many ways, the Federalist Papers has an understanding of human nature that is similar to Christianity. We Christians believe in the power of sin over human beings, a power that can never be uprooted even by a sincere change of heart done by grace through the transforming work of the Holy Spirit. Sin is always going to be ever present. But at the same time, human beings are made in the image of God. We have a connection to God through our rationality that makes us the greatest of all created beings. And so this is, we have to be, because we're the ones that Jesus died for. Jesus cares about humans in a particularly special way. And so the framers, despite not mentioning Christianity in these Federalist Papers, there still is a sense in which there's a Christian view of human nature that's being communicated here. In the next 2 weeks, we're going to look more specifically at how the Constitution's political science plays out in these specific institutions, such as the legislature, the executive, and in week 7, we'll look at the judiciary. So hopefully this has been a helpful session for understanding that the Constitution system, how the Constitution promotes reason and reflection in its system. So briefly, some tips for your quiz. So do remember that your quizzes are not written by me. They're pre-made quizzes based on the readings that someone else wrote years ago. I don't know when. But because of this, some of the questions I think are somewhat pedantic. They're asking questions that are kind of within the readings that you could easily miss. So I wanted to give you some hints. So be sure to read the Thomas West chapter very carefully. Some of the questions on the quiz will involve points from the Thomas West chapter readings. Be sure to pay attention to Locke's argument regarding the relationship between labor and property rights. Does the value of property come from labor, or does it come from nature? Look for that in the West reading. Look also for how government regulates political opinions of radio and television companies. That's also a point you should look for in the reading, because there will be a question about it on the quiz. Additionally, look for commentary on how textbooks and scholars today present the founding and their position on property rights. Do scholars and textbooks generally present the founders' views as being subtle, harsh, or something else entirely? Consider in the West reading the discussion of Thomas Jefferson's reforms of entail and primogeniture in Virginia. What were Jefferson's goals when he set out to reform Virginia's system of property holding? And lastly, look for a discussion of incorporated property rights. Look for So what is incorporation in discussions about property rights, and which citizens had that right in 1811? There are questions about these things on the quiz. There are also questions that are connected to the lecture material from this week and last week, but I wanted to make sure that you had some sense of what to look for in those lengthy West readings, because there will be quiz questions about it, and they didn't fit that naturally into the lecture, so I thought I would say something about it here. Thank you guys so much. I hope this was helpful, and I look forward to speaking to you again next week. Bye-bye.